Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Make. It's Marco here, and today we talk about what I like to call blanchitsu boxes. It's rare for me to find the time for a personal project, but when the universe sends you all the pieces you need to build something cool at the same time, you don't argue with the universe and you start building. I think we need a bit of context here. I love boxes, any shape or material. There is a limitless storytelling potential in a box, especially when you don't know what's inside. The purpose of a box defines its shape and aesthetic, and I'm fascinated by the engineering and the problem solving involved in adapting the simple concept of a box to a specific function. I thought to be alone with this strange box fetishism until I discovered that Adam Savage from Tested have a similar interest for cool boxes. The one-day builds of the early life of the channel about this topic are still my absolute favorites today, but I didn't find a news for this interest specifically focused on miniatures, except for the efficient storage and transport of the models, but nothing that you can really define as cool. What I was looking for was hidden in plain sight, and thanks to the GrimDark, blanchitsu and more than community, I discovered that there were artists with the same interest that were already pushing the limits of the idea of a diorama box to the extreme. Just imagine to arrive to the gaming club with your models already telling their cool story from the carry box. They instantly go from gaming tokens to something with a soul. I don't want to undermine anybody, but for me, the absolute master of this art is Nicolas Grillet, that recently arrived to put an entire, super detailed, playable modern battlefield in a box. I put a link to his Instagram in the description because you need to see his amazing works. After a couple of attempts that I immediately destroyed because really too ugly, I created this one to store and transport my kill teams with style.
The base is a cookies tin painted and weathered to look like an old office supply forgotten in a corner of some imperial office. I imagine the inside like the room of a spaceship or a space hulk, dark, rusty and full of old machinery and equipment. I used plastic card and cardboard to create the layout of the walls, and then I filled the space with a ton of bits to add movement and interesting details. I used only thin cardboard on the floor, so the magnets I put under my bases can still easily grab the metal of the box, and the models will always stay perfectly in place. Since the tin doesn't have an handle, it's rarely my first choice to carry the models around, but it became one of my favorite backdrops to take pictures of sci-fi models.
I'm tinkering with the idea of a fantasy scenic carry box since Warcry came out this summer, but at the moment I don't have the tools to build my own custom wood structure, so I needed to wait for the perfect base to knock to my door. Flea markets are the best places to find this kind of stuff, and during the holidays I finally found my holy grail.
For 10 euros I brought home this mysterious electrical device that, for what I understood, is a medical supply of the early 20s, able to shock you with an invigorating discharge of electricity. I'm probably destroying a piece of medical history, but art has the priority now. Basically, the story of my life. The whole mechanical block in the front part is screwed to the wood, so it's pretty easy to remove, keeping everything intact. The previous owner also added new modern cables to the device. Could be interesting to discover what's the output of this mechanically charged battery. There is this wood partition in the middle that I need to remove. It seems just slotted in the lateral walls, but it doesn't want to come off easily. I started work trying to be conservative, but it's already time for the berserker mode. I started trying to break the thin wood with a pair of clippers, but I immediately switched to the razor saw. The idea is to remove a middle part so I can reach better the pieces slotted in the lateral walls with the pliers. Now it's all a matter of brute force. Before moving to the artistic part, I need to add a floor where my magnetized models can stick to. I always have a stash of this kind of thin ferromagnetic materials, really useful also to add to the models little elements able to attract magnets. This way you can limit the number of holes you have to drill on a model, or easily magnetize difficult small surfaces. This is just the lid of another cookies tin. Be careful when you work with this kind of sharp materials, it's very easy to cut yourself. This is a classic do as I say, not as I do situation. The measures of the box are slightly irregular, so better to invest a bit more time taking the right numbers than regret a bad cut in the later steps. When I have in place my double-checked shape, I can start cutting using a simple pair of scissors. This tin is so thin that feels like cutting through cardboard. Just be careful around the edges. Here's the result with the tin attached to the box with simple fluid superglue. Don't worry too much about the aesthetic or being excessively clean at this point, because everything will be covered by an heavy texture later. The lid has these cool metal elements already perfectly weathered by the time, used to all the accessories of the battery that you can unscrew from this central element here. I want to keep them because they can easily hold a deck of Warcry cards and probably also a bag of tokens. Here on top I added a print of one of my favorite John Blanche's illustrations from Mordheim's rulebook. I photoshopped the image to give it dark faded edges, and I printed it on a thick sheet of cotton rag paper to have a more ancient medieval look using a paper that can easily absorb a thick layer of PVA glue without producing wrinkles. This is probably not the best order of operations because it's easy to stain the print with glue and paints, but I was really impatient to have a more thematic lid. Sometimes you need to boost your own inspiration. Time to start working on the walls. Since I want to use the box for Warcry and to move around my Mordheim warbands, I want a simple design able to fit these different worlds. The initial plan was to use scraps of milliput and dust to build old ruined walls, but I quickly discovered that it's more time consuming trying to fit a bunch of irregular pieces in a working shape than creating new walls from scratch. As I pointed out in the video about basing with dust, I'm completely incapable of producing a uniform flat surface using a rolling pin. So again, I use the help of my lovely lady while I'm demoted to human duct tape. You can use any kind of hair drying clay and epoxy putty or even stuff like Super Scalpy or Fimo that need to be cooked for this job. In general, for this kind of works I prefer to use hair drying clay because of its low stickiness, so it's easier to work with finely textured rolling pins. Usually it's better to compensate the weak spots of dust adding some PVA glue to its structure. And you can check the video up here for all the details. But this time I'll skip this step. I need simple, large rectangular shapes that will be completely supported by walls of thick wood, so I don't need the elasticity or the extra resistance provided by the PVA glue. I recently added to my collection of tools the silicone guide rings for the rolling pins. The rings come in a height of 2, 4 and 5 mm and are pretty useful to maintain a uniform thickness on the whole surface. I still can't produce a decent flat film of dust to save my life, but I had a great review from my lovely assistant. But I'm really good at being picky with measurements, so you can imagine the joy to work for me. I prefer to cut the rectangular shape of the walls when the clay is totally playable, to avoid any trouble or unpredictable cracks when its structure is dry and completely inelastic. You can simply use the back of a knife to make all the cuts. You don't need to be super precise with the measurements, and especially when playing with dust, I suggest you to use some extra material because these kind of clays have inside a lot of moisture that will evaporate, reducing their volume. You can always cut or sand the edges later to get a precise fit and perfectly square sides. I plan to produce smaller irregular shapes out of these rectangles, so the only important thing here is to have clean squared edges to fit the rims of the box. A little break to thank my best patrons. Our community is growing constantly, and sharing our knowledge we are producing incredible stuff. Thanks a million for your support, guys. Back to my territory for a quick test fit of the pieces. I need to adapt the final measures of the dry clay to the various parts of the box, testing all the moving pieces with the new volumes. I mark the excess with a Sharpie and I trim it using a sharp blade. I also leave some kind of registration marks to remember how to glue them in place. I want to give the idea of old, ruined walls from an abandoned city of Sigmar, or from Mordheim itself. So I break the walls to simulate deep cracks in the structure of this imaginary building. I remove material around the cracks to gain extra space between the pieces of the wall. My only concern here is to keep intact the squared edges for a perfect match with the box. But this extra movement between the cracks gives me all the freedom I need to align everything perfectly. I use epoxy glue to fix the texture walls to the structure. Epoxy glue is great to get a solid bond between the porous surface of dust and the non-porous surface of the coated wood. It will add to the equation its elasticity and its rubbery strength that will compensate for the lack of elasticity of pure dust, and this will be really important for a box that will be moved around constantly. You need to work in small batches because epoxy glue dries pretty quickly, around 5 and 10 minutes depending on the brand and the formulation. So for large works like these, you need to work a couple of pieces at a time, with a clear image of the position you want for them. I use big clamps to keep everything tightly in place while the glue dries. When the box is open, the front wall comes down, becoming an extension of the floor. So I make smaller pieces to create the idea of rubbles or a ruined floor, but still coherent with the aesthetic of the other walls when someone looks inside the closed box from above. Now it's just a matter of gluing the puzzle. And here is the result with all the pieces in place. Now I need to add a finer texture to tie everything together, sealing all the various edges, hiding at the same time all the boring flat surfaces. I prepare a mix of different sizes of sand and little rocks, static grass, fine sand and ground dirt. This will give me an incredible variety of different textures in the same mix. Then I add thick concentrated PVA to obtain a sticky consistent paste. I start from the base applying a thin layer of my mix. I don't want to add too much volume over the floor because I want a good connection between the magnets and the base, so I need to keep the extra volume to a minimum. The stippling brush strokes and all the stuff inside the mix will provide a nice interesting texture even with this delicate application. I add more material around the edges of my walls to fill and hide the seam lines. Same thing around all the cracks, the upper and lateral edges, hiding the structural point and connecting all the pieces together. This glue dries pretty quickly, so in a couple of hours I can move to the last building step, adding bits. If you collect miniatures for enough time, you end up with a ton of little extra pieces and bits. To save space, I keep mine in thematic Ziploc bags inside bigger Ziploc bags. This is the best part of this kind of projects, and you don't need a huge collection to find the pieces you need. Creating a diorama box most of the times means that you have to create a story with a minimal amount of details, because you need to keep all the useful space to carry the models. Browsing through the bits, I came up with the idea of a secret small camp in the ruins, with a little votive corner in one side, with tombstones, scrolls and candles, and old rusty equipment and ancient trophies on the others. I glue the bits using super glue and super glue activator for a quick bond, and I seal the rims of the various elements, especially the details on the ground, with my texture paste, to hide the edges and blend them with the environment. And here is the result when everything is dry, with all the little details in place. Time to paint! I want to keep this step really quick and simple, creating a neutral color palette that will easily adapt to every possible warband I'll put inside the box. I start masking the edges of the wood structure with some tape. I want a nice, strong separation between the diorama and the box. I spray everything with black. And I create a simple value modulation spraying white ink from above, straight from the bottle. From here I jump directly to oil paints, preparing on the palette black, burnt umber, magenta and a bright emerald green that will be my main sensation for the wall covered in moss and mold. And I mix thick washes adding white spirit. Oil washes produce a very natural finish, particularly good for terrains and dioramas, creating nice dripping effects on vertical walls. And thanks to their long drying time, they are really easy to blend. I simply apply the green in the upper parts, burnt umber in the middle, and black in the lower parts. A brush with a bit of white spirit used with vertical brushstrokes will blend all the tones together in a couple of seconds. This will create a rich tonal modulation over the value modulation painted with the airbrush. The two main parts of an interesting paint job synthesize in two very quick and very easy steps, with a perfect finish for all walls and ruins. I close the paint job with a very delicate dry brush. I use cheap craft store acrylics for this job, and I move the brush from top to bottom to catch only the upper edges of the details, to keep the sense of the light coming from above. And I add a light effect on the flames of the candles using the airbrush, like I did for the Axe of Gotrek in this video up here. And here is the final result. A compact box naturally weathered by time, a solid leather handle and a safe lock. Inside all the space to carry an expanded warband, and I choose on purpose the gang with the biggest bases to show you how they fit. And on the lid, a practical way to carry the game accessories that becomes an handy dice tray. And inside you have a glimpse of the warband in its natural environment. A little living portable diorama for an assured wow effect when you bring your models to the table. This is the simplest form a blanchitsu diorama box can take, and the only limit here is your imagination.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can always ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check the Patreon page and its rewards, or ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!